Hello and welcome to this, the first in which we suspect is a couple of episodes of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
And
it's not the first episode of Battling with Business.
It's not I kind of hadn't thought through what I was going to say before we started. The point I was going to make, and you're absolutely correct, it's not the first episode of Battling with Business. We're up to 250 episodes or something. But it is the first in a series of episodes where something we've threatened to talk about for a number of months now and we've not got around to, I really wanted to dig in. And that topic is around leadership, management, culture, trust, all the things we've talked about over the last 250 episodes, and starting to ask the question, what does that mean in the world of AI? And the reason why I was really, really interested in talking about this is everyone is talking about AI, understandably taking over the world, whether it be in the military sphere, whether it be civilian sphere, whether it's geopolitical, that's all fantastic. I think we're still trying to figure out what that will actually mean in the next 1 to 5 years.
Yep.
That's fine. However, beyond then what the impact on jobs and who will not have a job, which again is pretty speculative. One of the topics which perhaps I'm just not listening in the right places, I haven't heard at all, is the idea of if the world is now jointly owned, or at least there is very large participation, everything we do by AI, what does that mean in terms of all the things we've talked about in terms of leadership and management,
culture? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a fascinating point, and I think it's worth exploring where we're not trying to recreate a lot of the conversations that are already being had around how it's going to affect the job market. Clearly, we will talk about these things as they will have implications, but there is lots of conversation about, is superintelligence on its way? You know, what will agentic AI mean for white-collar jobs? What happens when robotics and AI meet and you end up with autonomous systems that can also do physical tasks? And there's a whole load of these conversations, and they're really, really important and really useful. We're perhaps not the best experts to talk about that.
No, well, I'm sure we'll have opinions, and obviously we'll touch on some of these topics.
What is really important, and as you've pointed out, isn't necessarily being talked about much, is this is happening, whether we like it or not. This is not a choice we have.
Well, also, and there's a really key point is, if we've just spent more than 250 hours, it's probably 300, even 400 hours, talking about how, as fleshy human beings, we can be better leaders and managers.
Yeah.
It turns out that we haven't answered all of those questions. And that's with literally hundreds, if not thousands of years of people trying to think about this. This is the wild card. This is the thing that no one has thought about. And so therefore, if we thought it was hard being a good leader or a manager before AI came along, I think we really need to start thinking about this. And there's some, rather than this being sort of a philosophical sense of, well, how can we be good managers? No, there's some very real and practical things that businesses will start to need to think about.
Yeah.
And I suspect have started to touch the first part of the elephant without knowing.
Yeah.
So
I know you've done quite a lot of thinking about this, and you've planned a structure for this mini-series, and I haven't, so I'm sort of being led by you. But I'm straight away, it strikes me there are three sort of aspects to this. One is, how does being a leader, manager, influencer of organizations change as you have to then incorporate non-human entities into that system? I.e., how do you manage AI that used to be employees that is now doing those jobs? So direct management of the tech itself. Then there's the element of, how do you manage and lead people as you are now dealing with presumably hybrid AI and human organizations? And then the third aspect, which is perhaps a little bit more philosophical or esoteric, is the, how do you manage people in a society that is changed and influenced by AI, which is more akin to sort of some of the conversations we've had around the effects of social media or other emerging technologies have affected the way people think and behave, and therefore you have to adapt your approach. So I think those three areas are of particular interest.
Well, you actually, you said you haven't done any preparation. I think the reality is we think about these things even subconsciously. I wanted to start with three. I've said the simple questions, or at least that's the notes I wrote. I think then maybe they're a bit more complex, but I think they overlap with a lot of what you've said. Here are the three questions. And just to be very, very clear, these are, I would imagine, the first three rather than the three. So please don't think of this as the complete view. This is sort of just the beginning. Again, I'm going to use the phrase, we're starting to touch the elephant in a dark room.
Yeah.
And we don't know it's an elephant yet. Otherwise, that sounds a bit weird. Anyway, here are the three questions. So the first question is, how can a leader lead an AI or someone making significant use of AI? And I think that absolutely touches on the first two of your questions. The next question I had for myself is, how do you create experience and knowledge when, at this point at least, people are beginning to suspect that the first roles to go are the most junior people who are ultimately going to be the people who would normally become the next leaders or experts. So if
Yeah.
you've got this sort of pipeline of expertise building that starts with the most junior, if you start to get rid of the beginning of that pipeline, what happens to your pipeline?
Yes. And we saw this a little bit with the COVID pandemic, where everybody was forced to sort of restructure and work from home, and that was okay if you'd already established your relationships, if you'd already got enough experience that you could effectively operate independently. But if you were starting out as perhaps a intern or a new joiner post university or post school into the workplace, and you haven't built those relationships and you hadn't built that experience and knowledge, actually it was far more detrimental because you were isolated and being expected to sort of do stuff without being able to pop over to somebody's office and ask a question, without having that social support network of being in an office surrounded by people who are getting on with things.
And I think that's quite a subtle one, and I agree with you. And I think lots of people who have brought people in since the pandemic have sort of started to see it.
Yeah.
It's not something people talk about a lot. I think this question becomes far more fundamental,
Absolutely.
which is
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
if you hire, I'll use the military, if you hire someone as a private and train them, and then 7 years later they plop out and they're a sergeant. If you don't hire the soldiers,
Yeah.
where are the sergeants going to come from? Maybe that analogy doesn't quite work, but there's a really interesting point there, which at the moment, all of the incentives are wrong. We'll come back to that.
So without wanting to sort of get...
See, these are good questions, aren't
Yeah,
they?
they really are. Without wanting to get people to sort of turn off and go and listen to another podcast, the Rory Stewart on The Rest is Politics has just done a mini-series on AI.
Yep.
And they're far better placed to sort of talk about some of the technical impacts of AI and perhaps some of the broader philosophical questions. But one of the things that they used as an example, and it's worth listening to that series to get the broader perspective, but they talked about this specific point, and they used the example of a legal firm and the fact that you would traditionally employ legal graduates as interns or paralegals, and they would do things like the photocopying and the spell checking and the first drafts of standardized letters and stuff. And it's really boring and turgid work, but you learn by doing that, and you learn the shortcuts and you learn the processes, and you watch more experienced solicitors, lawyers make decisions and do things and recognize which bits of the law you need to absolutely have memorized, which bits you need to be able to look up quickly, and which, and you learn through watching people who've built a career over 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and then you grow into those roles. One of the first things we've seen with large language models particularly is that jobs like paralegals who are first drafting, they're the first to go because something that LLMs are
Can do really
particularly good
well.
at
Yep.
is replicate similar documents to things that have been done many, many times before, because that's in the data set. So if you need a first draft of a letter, if you need a first draft of a legal document, a general LLM can do it, but there are now very specifically trained legal LLMs. The challenge comes not now. Actually, legal firms are probably saving money, but in 10 years' time, when those paralegals haven't progressed to
Where
become,
are the next
where
generation of
does the next
people to
generation
build?
come
So
from?
I think
Yeah.
there's an awful lot there. And you sort of said we don't want to stop people going off to listen to another podcast. Hell, it's our podcast. We can say, we're like, actually, I would strongly recommend you go and listen to the Rory Stewart podcast. I listened up to episode 3, which I think, as the time of recording this is the latest one. It is superb. It is, I think, the best I've certainly heard in terms of, in layman's terms, talking exactly what the implications are, but at a real deep level. Which takes me, interestingly enough, onto the third question, which is, with fewer or even potentially no people, what does AI mean for organizations that care about values, culture, and trust? And going back to the Rory Stewart podcast, if Rory is listening, by the way, if Rory is listening, we'd love to have you on the podcast. I presume he isn't listening, but I actually stopped listening after the first half of the third episode. And the reason why I stopped listening wasn't because I was busy or I was bored. He was actually tackling this question of values and trust and culture. And he had a guest on who was a very good and well-informed guest. And he was saying, if the United States effectively owns the keys to all the future of AI, given how politically they are at the moment with America First, is this not a bad thing for AI? And the person he was interviewing refused to engage with that question. Now, either because
Was the person he was interviewing an American?
he was an American.
Yeah.
Now, either it was because he thinks this is a crazy idea and Americans and the American government generally does things for the good of all mankind, or he was worried about giving an answer that people didn't like. But I thought this whole idea of morals and values was illustrated well. I stopped listening because I didn't want to hear him avoid the question for the fourth time, because Rory Stewart was making the point, and we will make this point at a sort of more local level. Whoever owns the AI holds power in a way they haven't done before. So I'm going to throw that back.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't listened to that episode. It reminds me of something that the comedian Jimmy Carr said about AI, which I thought was incredibly insightful and very poignant, which was, at the moment, most of the conversation is about what do we do to protect our jobs. I'm going to lose my job. And that is a very real concern, and I'm not dismissing that. But Jimmy Carr says that's a minor problem. We will adapt to a changing job market. We've done it before. Yes, it will be painful, and it will be particularly painful for some people, and we shouldn't overlook that, and we should create soft landings and transitions and off-ramps and all the rest of it. And that is a government policy sort of discussion to have. More importantly, though, is about the societal trust issue. And the thing we should be really worried about is control of information. And one of the things AI enables you to do is rapidly, very rapidly, make a lot of sense out of very unstructured data. And we've had unstructured data search before, we've had network connectivity before, but this is a step change in the ability to create understanding from a wide network of information sources. And that's fine whilst everything's going well and whilst you trust the people that hold the keys to power. And in this case, as you pointed out, that is large American tech companies, and that is a result of their sort of symbiotic relationship, the US government. Jimmy Carr made the point that more Jews were rounded up and executed in the Netherlands than per capita than any other country in Europe. And the reason was, in the Netherlands, they kept better records. And his point was, prior to invasion by the Nazis, that was a good thing. Everybody trusted the Dutch government. It wasn't the Stasi in East Germany years later. It was a good thing. It was a bureaucratic system where they were running an efficient government. Bad people took control of those records and took control of that power and did really, really bad things with it. AI, when combined with the Internet of Things, and that is the connected network of sensors, mobile cameras, CCTV networks, the ability to crawl through records and connect information, creates a huge amount of surveillance power. And I think potentially that is a subject we possibly want to explore as one of the episodes in this mini-series is, what does AI do to surveillance and the ability to control and understand? But there is a risk, and we've got to be really, really careful that we don't dismiss the answer of, yeah, but we trust the people that hold the power. We need to diffuse power, and we need to have checks and balances.
I think you're absolutely right. And what's interesting is you can hear that this touches us at the largest level, at a state level, but also down to an individual level. So those are the three questions which I wanted us to start to tackle. I think this might take us a couple of episodes, knowing how we talk about these things. But just before we start to tackle these, what I want to make really clear here is this is not because we enjoy navel gazing, although, spoiler alert, we probably do enjoy navel gazing. This is all about how do you position yourself to be most successful.
Yeah.
So going back to that question about what happens if you get rid of your initial layer of managers, we can have a philosophical conversation about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or how you might think about it. The more interesting question is, and you've said this on a number of occasions, in change, in situations where there is even catastrophe, there is opportunity.
Yeah.
And the best leaders, managers, and organizations will seek out that opportunity. So the organization that solves that problem first of how do I make sure I replace that first early tranche of my future leaders and how do I deal with that is going to have an advantage over other organizations. So this isn't just a philosophical discussion. This is another very practical leadership discussion.
Well, I think we should actively avoid the philosophical discussion of, is this a good or bad thing? Because a bit like the internet or social media or
nuclear weapons,
mechanization or nuclear weapons, this is happening.
I agree. I don't, and I.
So we shouldn't shy away from recognizing the positives and or the negatives.
I think that's the point.
Having the discussion about is it good or bad is kind of erroneous. We need to focus on how do we best harness the power of it? How do we best mitigate the risks? And how do we best adapt our own organizations and our own systems to this brave new world?
Exactly. So just before we start to sort of dive into those three questions, and I think we'll do that after our first break, what I wanted to do was for us to sort of play a little bit about what do we think that future might look like. And as you mentioned at the very beginning, I think we'll do a very shallow and potentially poor job of that. But I wanted to set the context when we talk about some of these things. So the first thing that struck me is that, and it is already happening, is AI helps guide or drive decisions of a whole bunch of people. Today, if I'm asked a complex question and I need a first draft of an answer, not my final answer, and an answer which builds on what I already know and how I already think and behave, I will go away and use an LLM to go away and do that. So I already use it every day, but that is going to get more and more. And I scribbled down the examples of those roles, and we'll talk about them more later, but just how it seems to me.
I'm just, before you move on from that, is a really important point is coming back to what you said about the next generation of people. For those people who've spent 20 years or however long, building an experience base, a knowledge set, skills, actually using LLMs, using AI as quick shortcuts to save time is really efficient and really useful. If you haven't done that and you're now using these tools in the same way, what you're not doing is building that knowledge and experience. And so a really easy example of this is in the education system. And Rory Sutherland, who we've mentioned on the podcast before, who I'm a big fan of because he thinks very differently about things. He comes from the world of marketing, but he just thinks about things from a slightly different perspective. And he makes the point that if you've done an undergraduate degree, you would have spent probably 3 years, maybe 2, writing lots and lots of assignments, lots of essays. How many people have ever gone back and reread the essays they wrote as an undergraduate?
None.
Very few, probably none. I certainly have never read or gone back and read anything I wrote as an undergrad. I don't think I even kept it. I didn't keep it at the time, let alone 20 years later. But that's not the point. You didn't write those essays to have a reference library or to think up new ways of thinking about the problem. Undergrad degrees are not there to expand the collective knowledge. They are there as an educational tool. You wrote those essays to make mistakes, to force you to read, to force you to analyse and synthesise. That isn't going to happen if you just use ChatGPT to summarise lots and lots of reading that you haven't done, or even go as far as to get it to write your essays for you.
Can I give you a really ridiculous comparison to what you've just said? Large language models, businesses or the tech companies spend millions, if not billions of dollars training those models.
Yeah.
The equivalent would be if all of a sudden you said, I'm not going to spend 3 months and billions training it, I'm going to spend a couple of weeks and 20 quid. The large language model would give you rubbish when you used it. Why is that any different with human beings?
Yes.
But
absolutely. I had a really interesting conversation with a university lecturer a few weeks ago. It was part of a larger debate around AI and its use in the arts, particularly around writing. But this lecturer was talking about the fact that years ago, not that many years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, they would look at an essay from an undergrad, or in fact, anybody, and they would be looking for things like correct punctuation and grammar. And of course, they're also looking for the content and the knowledge, but the first cursory glance is, have you bothered to put it in the right format? Have you bothered to reference it correctly? Have you bothered to check your spelling and your grammar and that was the first sort of heuristic, if you like, that academics would use to understand whether you are
competent,
and therefore they would delve further. So you'd lose marks for, spelling mistakes and formatting and stuff. And there's set percentages for these things. They don't do that anymore because AI means that everybody's essays are perfectly spelled, perfectly formatted, or mostly. And actually, the opposite has happened. And if you submit an essay that does have grammatical errors, that does have some formatting mistakes, then actually there's this sort of inbuilt sense of joy within the academics that are looking at these things, because they're like, this is one that's been put together by a human. It hasn't been polished by AI. So you don't get extra marks anymore for being perfect. But if you're imperfect, you actually get perhaps a little bit more scrutiny and attention. And he said it's the essays that have the spelling mistakes that tend to do better because they show more imagination, because they tend to be the ones that
we should come back to that and talk about imagination and the ability to have novel ideas. But before we get to that, so in this first case that we've talked about, it is about AI helping and guiding humans. So it's AI plus a human. And we see this today, customer service, product managers, the world I live now, you can say, help me write something that would have taken me half an hour and it will do it very quickly. You've mentioned lawyers, we have doctors. So that's the first category, which we are seeing increasing amounts of. I think people are very comfortable with because you're taking the drudgery away. There's risks. We'll come back to other questions, but that's good. The next one I want to talk about, which is very much the future, and I have no reason to believe this won't happen, is AI literally replacing human beings. This is not about making them go faster.
Yeah.
This is about saying there is something that you do today that an AI statistically can do better or faster and certainly cheaper.
Yeah.
And to get really into the nitty gritty, there are lots of people today saying that AI and large language models can pass doctors' boards, in fact, score higher
Yeah.
than junior doctors. And so the first AI replacement you might see, and I think everyone will get angry about it for the first 5 years, and then 10 years later, no one will question it. Doctors, your local doctor, when you say, my toe hurts, then an LLM will give you a good service and will tell you as much, if not more, possibly more accurately than a local doctor.
Yeah.
And they will do it for free. And they'll do it 24 hours a day. Call center operators for banks. I hate the fact that I can't speak to a human being and that I have to spend 30 seconds pressing buttons and trying terribly to describe the problem is. Frankly, if you gave me an LLM that said, hello, Chris, what do you want? And I talk to them like a human being, which I do today with Perplexity. There's a mode of Perplexity, and I think in ChatGPT we can literally talk to it. I would take that. So,
well, I completely agree. And I think, firstly, we've been quite negative, I think, about some of the impacts of LLMs particularly, but AI. And that's because I think we're focusing on where the friction points and the challenges are. I want to just make the point that some of this is really, really positive. It's going to have a really good effect on our economies, on our productivity, on our quality of life. Some of it won't. And so I don't think we're advocating for getting rid of LLMs or not using them, or we're simply pointing out where the frictions are. That example of call centers is a really interesting one because, like you, and I think like the vast majority of people, a press 1 for this, press 2 for this, and endless kind of loops, and all you want to do is talk to a human because the problem you're dealing with is complex and there's nuance, and a tree diagram of options isn't going to help you, and it just slows you down and it frustrates you. And normally you're already dealing with a problem, and so there's friction, you're tense and often angry or whatever. Yesterday, I had a particular problem with the administrative system for one of the companies I work with. And it's a problem I've had for coming up 3 years. And it's a minor problem, but it keeps creating pay issues. It keeps creating record accounting errors. And I've dealt with the HR team for 3 years, and they never quite get to the nub of the issue. And so they do little fixes for whatever the problem is at the time, but they're not fixing the underlying issue. And for 3 years, I've got more and more frustrated. And I've learnt about the administrative system of this organisation and some of the details in a way that, because it's specific to my problem, that when I first deal with a new HR person, they haven't. And I've never managed to quite get the problem fixed. Yesterday, they've introduced a Copilot support function. I had a 15-minute to and fro conversation with Copilot, and it immediately identified the problem. I put some screenshots of some of the HR material into this conversation. And within 15 minutes, it said, I see exactly where your problem is. This is the error that's been made. This is where it's been compounded. And this is why people can't see it or understand it. Would you like me to draft an email? And I drafted an email and I sent it to the HR team. And I got a response back saying, oh yeah, that's exactly the problem. And it has solved a problem that humans couldn't solve for 3 years. And I think that's where there are some real advantages to this stuff.
So I think you would be a fool now not to assume that what we have just described, whether it's AI helping humans or AI removing humans, is going to happen. And as you say, there is lots of good outcomes as well as bad outcomes for it. Here's the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is we've talked about human beings being assisted, businesses, the military and governments, I am sure, are already using AI, not just to sort of do things, but to make policy and strategy decisions.
Yes.
There is going to be a future where I can imagine an AI will say, we should not attack this country, or we should not attack this beach, or we should not use these units. I would imagine there is a government that says, an AI that will eventually advise a government and say, you shouldn't increase VAT, you should do this. So we shouldn't assume it is just, as it were, in front of our faces. There is going to be a blurring of decision making, who makes it, how it is made, at the most fundamental levels.
Yeah.
And that, now obviously, this is the kind of thing that is generally hidden is the wrong word, but people don't want to talk about this.
Yeah.
I am sure this is starting to happen today. Certainly in terms of the military, I know there are AIs helping targeting, taking lots of information targeting, but I think we should assume AI are going to play a part in those decisions that are made.
Yeah. So I think there's a few elements to this. As we're recording this, there is an unfolding news story about, I think it was West Midlands Police Service, making the decision about
whether to allow a football game to go ahead.
Yeah, was it Tel Aviv versus one of the Midlands football teams, and the match was abandoned on the recommendation of a body of people, but including West Midlands Police.
And they wrote a report
based on the security situation, based on ongoing, global strategic, geostrategic issues in the Middle East, Gaza, Israel, etc., and heightened a growing anti-Semitism, which is happening right across the world, but disappointingly also here in the UK, as well as Islamophobia, right-wing populism, a whole load of issues that are creating an increase in threats. And they wrote this report and they suggested that this match shouldn't go ahead. Within this report was what is called a hallucination, which is where an LLM, whilst aggregating and synthesizing large amounts of data, fills in the gaps with what it thinks is the logical semantic next bit of the sequence. I'm oversimplifying that slightly.
Even if it sometimes makes it up.
But it makes a best guess rather than a mathematical function where there is a right or wrong answer. And therefore what you end up with is, as humans do, errors in judgment.
Well, but let's turn into reality. It invented a football match
that never happened. Yeah, and talked about how that had created problems, and that I don't know how much that invented football match swayed the argument. I don't know. I haven't gone into the detail of it. The police force in question, West Midlands Police Service, denied that they'd used an LLM, and I suspect in this case that's because it was used to save time and somebody was lazy, rather than it being a policy of having an AI system as part of the board of the decision-making process. And perhaps this is an interesting point.
But we're looking ahead to what is going to happen.
Yeah.
So you gave an example, which is probably, we assume, someone did something to speed things up. It wrote the report, it hallucinated. I've got another brilliant example, which I really enjoyed, which was a couple of weeks ago, we did our emergency podcast on Venezuela.
Yeah.
And I asked an LLM to help write a summary paragraph of all the things that had happened,
right,
just to make it easy and so it made sense. And I said, please give me a quick summary paragraph on all the events over the last 5 days so I can use it to introduce the podcast. And it said, listen, Chris, you need to maintain your credibility in this podcast. These things did not happen.
Oh, wow.
It literally came out and said, the things you have told me that happened in Venezuela did not happen. And so this is a perfect example.
Yeah.
I know you're looking at me shaking my head. Now, but the point I think is really important to make is this is something that was revealed, and in the I don't know, in the great scheme of things, the fact they invented a football game was probably not the most important thing to happen. But let's go back. A government has said we are going to use an LLM to help us decide fiscal policy or who to put in jail or any of these things. If any of this happens, you now have a problem that, what do you mean we're going to war because the AI thought it had read things that did a thing?
So I think there's a slight pushback, which would be people make mistakes as well. And these models are getting better. So when producing images, probably no more than 2 years ago, it was routine that you'd end up with 6 or 7 fingers on a person, or eyes that were looking in the wrong directions, and weird sort of anomalies. Those have been sort of ironed out. It still makes mistakes, but far less. So these things are improving. People make mistakes as well, and we need to be really careful that we don't have a system where we say we're not going to use AI to help us make judgment decisions because sometimes they make mistakes, when actually people make mistakes.
I agree, but in the same way, when people make mistakes, it's wrong for us to say we're not going to think about the mistake they've made and understand the difference.
Yeah.
And here's the final point I wanted to make about what the future might be, whether it's...
Well, before you do, I just want to sort of close this off. I think with that West Midlands Police Service example, the problem wasn't with the LLM or the AI. The problem was the policy around how they use it, and a misunderstanding of what it can do and should do. Probably because an individual or a couple of individuals took shortcuts. So they used it to write a report that they should have written. A bit like that academic I was talking about earlier, marking students' reports. They have moved on from the policy of you're not allowed to use LLMs to write essays. What they now say is, absolutely, use the tools to help you write the essay, but you need to be very, very sure of the facts within your essay. You need to be adding your original thought. You need to use the LLM as a tool, not as a replacement for your thinking.
I think you've said that very well, because I was worried you were going down a road which sort of said, well, yes, your LLM said that the events in Venezuela didn't happen, but the LLM will get better and so it'll be okay. I think your point about trust but verify.
Yeah,
and this
exactly
is,
that.
this
Exactly
is
that. But we need to make sure that we're not... So in driverless cars, for example, this is another emerging, and it is going to come very, very quickly. I drove past an autonomous vehicle yesterday.
I've been in an autonomous
It had a driver,
vehicle,
but the driver didn't have his hands on the steering wheel and was looking out the window. This is in the UK, which 2 years ago, that was like, we're miles off that. This happens in San Francisco. Coming. Driverless cars are a really, really good example of where the technology rubs up against society's fears. We hold driverless vehicles, to a higher standard than we hold human drivers. In that the adoption of autonomous vehicles, we are expecting a level of error correction to be far, far above what we expect from human drivers. So we will only accept robot cars driving around our roads when we're absolutely sure they're not going to accidentally crash and kill people. Under 40, the largest killer in the UK is road traffic accidents. That is almost always because of human error. Very rarely is it a mechanical failure. Very rarely is it anything other than a human error or a combination of human and environmental error. And yet we tolerate that, but we wouldn't tolerate it from autonomous vehicles, even though if we lowered our standards, we would save lives.
So I think we're falling into the trap of getting into whether AI is good or bad. And I think what we started with was AI can be good and can be bad.
I don't think...
Well, no, the reason why I say it is because I want to get onto the more interesting bits. Because otherwise it becomes a little bit someone's always going to tell me that the AI is better. Someone's going to tell me it's worse.
Yeah,
you're right. But here's the point I really wanted to make.
Yeah.
The point is this. We will like most of their decisions, many of their decisions, all of their decisions, some of their decisions. but we won't know why they have made the decision. That is the bit which I think we need to think about. How do we deal with?
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
the why is really important. We have talked about examples where demonstrably it was right or wrong. Fantastic. But we don't know why it was right, and we don't know why it was wrong. And that's the bit which I think will have, getting onto the sort of the leadership and management side of things, that is much more interesting. I am a manager of a person in a call center, a lawyer, who gave some advice based on an LLM. The LLM in this particular case, for whatever reason, was not correct. What do I do? Do I fire that person? Do I fire the LLM or something? That's the bit which I think is interesting, is that this is the unique challenge, which to some degree humans have as well, but I think even more so, which is the reasoning behind these LLMs is opaque. That is neither good nor bad. It is a statement of what it is, but it has knock-on effects in terms of understanding leadership, understanding how we manage, how we engage with these things. That was the point that I wanted to make.
And it's a really important point, and I completely agree. But I think if you look at the driverless cars example, as an example, you have the same challenge with when humans make a mistake. You don't know why a human necessarily made a mistake in the same way. We don't worry about it quite so much. And I think that's an interesting quirk of, we expect machines, and that's ultimately what these things are, to be perfect, yet we are quite comfortable with the fact that humans are imperfect. And there's a great book by Daniel Kahneman called Noise, and I've talked about Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist, before. His last book, before he died, was called Noise, and it was all about the fallibility of decisions that get made based on a whole load of random external factors. Like, judges, on average, hand out harsher sentences in the afternoons than they do in the mornings. No one really knows exactly why. We can surmise that it's because they're getting tired towards the end of the day, they're distracted, they want to go home, but we don't know, because this is internal to the neurological systems of a human brain. In the same way that we don't know how LLMs are coming up with their judgments. I think we need to start thinking about LLMs as judgment systems, not decision systems, and stop thinking about binary and recognize that hallucinations happen because they're not solving a mathematical problem. They are inferring probabilities, and therefore there is a judgment aspect to it.
I think that's a lovely way of describing it, judgment versus decision, because we do see them as decision making, and judgment is better, which leads us back to one of our questions, and we'll take a break in just a second. It leads us back to one of these questions. If your LLM is making poor judgments, and I'll give you an example. Is it raining or not raining? Well, that's not really a judgment. There's an answer. There's not a lot.
Demonstrable.
But if you say, are you adhering to our cultures of value? That's much harder. And all of a sudden, if you're not adhering to our cultures and value, what do I do now as a leader? We'll come back to that. Let's take a quick break. We covered a lot there and hopefully set the conversation up. I think this one's going to run and run, but let's take a quick break and we'll come back. And when we come back, we'll start with that first question. How can a leader lead an AI, or even lead someone making use of an AI? We'll do that straight after the break. Welcome back. The plan was we were only going to talk for half an hour before the break, and it shows that this is one of those topics where it rolls and rolls. For the rest of this episode, we'll just stick to this first question, because I think then we'll have two more questions to go through that show how novel and complex this is. Again, I'm trying to get away from good or bad because just to reiterate, I think there will be good and bad things that will
absolutely.
happen.
Yeah.
It is about, okay, good. How do we build this into our operating system? So that first question, how can a leader lead an AI? If you are a leader, if you're a manager and two of your team members are humans and two of your team members are AI, how do you lead them? Or how do you lead someone? You've got a team of 4 people and they all use LLMs to make their decisions and do the work. How do you do that? And I want to put this through the lens of authority, accountability, and I'm going to use this weird phrase, the erosion of managerial legitimacy.
Yeah.
If I am a
yeah.
manager, how can I be a legitimate manager if I've got 3 AIs working for me?
Well, it's interesting that you've talked about, if you've got 2 humans and 2 AIs, or if you've got 3 AIs working, we're not going to know. We're not going to have AI, chatbot 1 doing that job in that desk, and we're going to have this AI doing this job in it. AI is a system of systems. It's a network. So you might replace 2 people, their jobs might disappear, and it being replaced by AI systems that are doing their outputs. What you're not going to have is 2 AIs to replace 2 humans. So straight away, that leadership challenge becomes even harder, because it's hard to describe what you're managing and what you're leading, let alone how to then do it.
Yeah. Well, so it gets even better than that. So if you think about it, managers have historically, their legitimacy, their authority comes from superior experience, judgment, and control over what's going on. So I happen to be a leader in the product management world because I've been a product manager for many years. I know how it works. I know the job. That gives me authority and legitimacy.
Yeah.
When an AI can outperform both the manager and everyone else in their team, whether it be analysis, prioritization, forecasting, even people-related decisions like hiring. Like if I'm a manager and the AI on my team says, don't hire him, now the questions are really a bit tricky. The first question is, who's in charge? And I think this is both terrifying, exciting, confusing. I don't know. But that literal sense of, if the AI is better at the job than you are, who is in charge?
Yeah.
So just this idea of leadership and managing, never mind the how do you write a review for an AI or how do you get them to change their behavior? That's all fine.
Yeah.
Are you really the manager or are they managing you now?
So I think this comes back to that discussion we had before the break about, is it a machine? Is it a system? Is it a tool? It's a judgment machine. So, and let's be really, really clear here. Whilst we are still, as a human race, trying to define and come up with a consensus definition of consciousness and sentience, we are not getting closer to sentience.
We are not.
So, these machines still work fundamentally off binary systems and Boolean algebra. So, it is still noughts and ones at its very, very lots of stratas below it, but at its foundational core, it is just a logic machine. So these are not things that have feelings. They replicate feelings, they replicate emotions, they make judgments, but they're not things that we need to care about their emotional well-being. Having said that, we do need to care about and think about how the data and the feedback into these systems evolves them as judgment machines. So one of the challenges here is to recognize that AI machines, logic machines, are so much better than humans at several very distinct things. Rapid processing of data, the number of calculations it can do in a period of time, and the access to data repositories. Those are 3 areas that humans just can't compete. Those are the 3 areas that we haven't been able to compete with computers since, the mid-1940s when we started to build these things, because they're working at light speed, and the processing clocks are working in picoseconds and nanoseconds. Once you get to those surface layers of judgment, though, we're now starting to then move beyond machine logic to judgment, and there's error built into that because there's errors in the data sets, because there's biases in the
Well,
algorithm,
but we
and
should
because there's
we should describe what you're
feedback
saying.
mechanisms
We
that
should
are...
describe what you're saying in a different way. If I say to an AI, "Is Gareth happy or sad?" and I give it a picture, it is doing pattern recognition.
Yeah.
It is saying,
Yeah.
I have been given 1,000 pictures of someone's being sad or happy, Gareth or not,
Yeah.
and I'm using to use patterns. So the idea of sort of the mechanistic, what's 2 plus 2, which they're very good at and can do very fast, this is something that goes further. So this idea of, should we hire someone or should we not hire someone, that's something that an LLM can absolutely do, based on the fact that it has learned about 20,000 people who have been hired and whether they were good or bad and whatever. So I agree that they're different, but it still comes back to this idea of, when the AI is better at almost everything that the manager does.
So the important thing there is, you said almost everything. If it's better than the manager at everything, then that, to me, would strike me as a perfect example where you don't need the manager, and you replace the job with the AI system. If there is a role for a human, and recognizing that human machine teaming is often better than the human alone, or better than the machine alone, then there is a role for the person. I think what we need to avoid, and what we perhaps need to get past, is this idea that the machine is better at my job than me, because it's not. It's better at aspects of the job. It's better at certain functions.
But I think we're getting,
because if it is better at your job than you, then you don't need to do your job.
So let's follow that through. By the way, I think you're right, but I think this difference between, are they good at some things that I do, are they good at all things that I do, or are they good at more things than I'm good at?
What I would say is, if you are a product manager, it would be foolish to say the AI systems that are working in my organization are better product managers than me.
Well,
because if that's what you believe, then you don't need project managers.
Well, for the next 15 to 20 years, I entirely agree with you, whilst I'm trying to draw some kind of a pay. Yeah. But I think the reality, we'll see. Look, if you can replace doctors, why can't you replace product managers? It's not what this is about. But
but I think my point is, that will happen.
Well, but
where it doesn't happen, there is a role for the human. And that's where it's then not a question of, how do I manage something that is better at my job than me? Because the fact that you have a job means that you have a human role, that you work alongside these systems. So rather than seeing them as employees, because it's not, it's a system, you see it, so it's not a case of, I need to somehow manage talent that is better than me. It's, I am working with tools that can do things better than I can.
So here's another question for you, and I don't know the answer. This isn't a trick question. I'm going to go, haha, I know the answer. Let's pretend, from a pure manager and leader perspective, that the AI is as good as I am. At being a manager and a leader.
Well, then why would your employer employ you?
Because I've got 4 people who need to be led and cared for. So the point is...
Well, hang on. If the AI is as good as you are,
then they're replacing everyone below.
Then it can manage those 4 people, and you don't need to be.
Well, but that's
if you have a role,
that's the point,
that your employer thinks is valuable, then clearly you and the AI as a human machine team are better than either you on your own or the AI.
But let's go down the path. There is an AI that is better than me, and so you had me fired. Thank you, Gareth, for having me fired. Okay. Can that, again, this is not a trick question, I don't know the answer. Can you have a manager of human beings who is an AI?
Yes, I think you can. Not perhaps in the traditional sense of your boss is going to be AI. But when we use satellite navigation systems, Satellite navigation systems 20 years ago were computational machines. So they solve mathematical problems and they gave you a very distinct answer. Now they are part of a network of systems where Google Maps, for example, tells you traffic density. It gives you real-time information about how much traffic is on the roads, what the flow rates are, where there are speed cameras, where there have been accidents, where there are roadworks, where there are police enforcement, a whole load of real-time information. It's also making decisions for you. And most people, we follow and trust our sat-navs. So we are being managed by a satellite navigation system plus the real-time data feed and the algorithms that have learned. So you will probably have experienced this. It's not uncommon to be in a vehicle with somebody else and your phones both give you a slightly different answer on the quickest route or the time of arrival or something. And that's because this is not a computational thing. This is a judgment algorithm. And there are differences between one device and the other in terms of they might be half a meter apart and that gives them a different position fix. You might have asked the question several nanoseconds earlier or later. And these things mean, what it means is when it tells you this is the shortest route, it isn't always the shortest route. It is a judgment prediction that over the course of the journey, it will be the shortest route, and we trust it. So we have effectively delegated the management of navigation to the machine, and we have subordinated ourselves to it. And very rarely do we go, I know better than the sat nav.
You've not met my in-laws there. but I agree with that. That's absolutely fine. But let's go back. I mean, I think where we're starting to get to, though, and I think this is the first interesting new point out of this, which is there are levels of management and trust that we might accept. So you are absolutely right.
There are far less people now like your in-laws. It used to be
agreed, but let's
quite
get back to the point.
People, I don't trust it, and I'm going to use my map.
You've used an important phrase, which is I am managed by the GPS for my navigation, which I 100% agree with, and I'm very comfortable with. If you said to me, your manager, the person who is looking after your well-being at work, judging your output, is an AI.
So I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, before you get why that's not going to happen, that is, I think the first point is there are different levels of control and management we as human beings might be willing to accept or comfortable with. And so I think there are, just to keep going, I think there will be a point where statistically having an AI as a manager for human beings will lead to more, I'm going to use the word, accurate outcomes. I am going to tell you need to improve your performance. I am going to realize you need time off and I will give you time off. But whether humans will want AI as leaders, and probably the reality is, and we're talking about a transition here, so the reality is Chris gets fired, but Chris's boss is now managing the people that Chris used to manage, and he's using an AI to the time. So there's sort of shades of grey here, but I think that's really interesting where there is. We should think about what levels of management we are willing the AI to have over us, and that will change over time. And as we were talking about this, the thing that struck me was it is all about how you build your edge as a business or as a leader. So there will be some businesses that say, we have cut £1 million from our budget because we've got rid of all of these middle managers. And there is another business that says we will attract the best talent, human talent, because we will guarantee that every single one of you will have a human being that you can talk to that isn't a robot. And this is what I'm trying to get at in these conversations. It's less about right or wrong. It's about what is the...
About 90 seconds ago, you made a Freudian slip because we were talking about management and will AI manage us? And then you said AI as leaders. I think it's worth going back to the fundamentals of the difference between leadership and management. Management is about allocation of resources. Now, those resources might be people, it might be time, it might be money, it might be stock, it might be energy, it might be road traffic density, but management is a resource allocation problem. And one of the things that AI and machines can do, we've already talked about, is real-time data processing across large networks. That means in a lot of cases, management can be done, at least in some part, better than by a machine. And we are seeing this in lots of areas. So if you work in stock distribution, it is not uncommon for the people that work in the warehouses to have, at least in some part, an AI-enabled machine system helping them or directing them with what to do next, each job. So allocation of go to this shelf, pick this parcel, put it in this pigeonhole, because it's making thousands of decisions a second that a person could never do. That's management. Leadership is about getting people to do things they don't want to do. It's an emotional, it's often about inspiration. Sometimes it's about the opposite. Sometimes it's about using a stick. Sometimes it's about setting examples. Sometimes it's about, I think really interestingly, I think we can accept that we will be managed to a greater or lesser extent by a machine that has demonstrable better capability than we do in certain areas, largely real-time processing of large amounts of data. The bigger question for me is the emotional connection and the ability to be inspired, the ability to be led by example, the ability to be understood, listened to, and empathized. And that's where I don't know. I think that's where there's ambiguity.
I don't see any reason why an LLM can't learn the patterns of all of those things.
Yeah.
Now, here's the sort of the test. What was the test? Is it the Turing test?
Turing test, yeah.
Which says that, Eliza, can you speak to a computer and do you know if they're a human or not?
Yeah.
The point being, if you never see your manager, they can be, or leader, they can be effective.
Yeah.
Could they be AI at some point? Interesting.
I suspect that's already happening.
Well, I suspect that is already happening. We don't know. But again, these are all things part of the purpose of this podcast is certainly not to give the answers because, oh my God, we do not have the answers. We're guessing what might happen. But actually, it's starting people to think, what would I do in those cases? Would we ever have a leader? I was just wondering, could you invent an entirely mythical company made by AI where there are no humans? You just go away and tell a bunch of AI systems, go build a business. You're the CFO, you're the chief product officer, you're the CEO, you're all the workers. I want you to go and do these things and here's how I want you to behave. Go. That's fascinating. I mean, this is something which I think many of the AI leaders say. They think there will be a $1 billion business started by two people and an AI. Interestingly, why didn't he say no people?
No people.
Here's the last thing that I want to talk about, and then we'll come to a wrap for this first episode. I think this is shifting sort of the view a little bit, which is, again, we've got people leading AI or leading people who are using AI. If an AI recommends or executes actions that affects customers, employees, or financial outcomes, and yet responsibility sits with a human, that's got to create a paradox, which is the manager is accountable for outcomes they didn't directly decide and may not fully understand. So this is more manager.
Yeah.
But over time, and this is the key point, does this risk turning managers into liability buffers?
Yeah.
Which is terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, no, we need you as a manager, Chris. Why is that? Because when it goes wrong, you're the one who needs to be accountable for it going wrong.
So I wonder, and this is an area where I'm certainly not an expert, but at the end of the financial crisis, 2008, huge impacts that we're still feeling the ripples of today. Whole businesses collapsing, whole economies collapsing, nations needing to be bailed out, Iceland declaring bankruptcy, a country. This was massive. And at the end of it, I think there was a handful of people that were actually found criminally liable, and that was a load of bankers for rigging the LIBOR rate.
This is, by the way, this is great. What we're saying is there is a future without responsibility because it's all the
And I
bloody
don't even
AI
know
fault.
what a LIBOR rate actually is, but it feels to me like that is perhaps where these financial systems are so complex now. And we almost have, systems, because you have automatic trading algorithms that are based off pattern recognition, and they're doing things at, 200 decisions a second, and we're seeing these flash crashes and all this sort of stuff. It's so complex that I don't think there's a single human who understands the financial system. And we found accountable a series of bankers for rigging a particular rate, which I don't think most people understand what it is, and certainly don't understand how it affects the system. Based on a really complex system that is mostly being done by computers talking to each other across
Yeah.
global fiber optic networks. Is that perhaps the start of this trend of, we find accountability in the areas where we can identify that people made decisions on the edges of complex networks, and it does raise these really interesting questions about accountability, responsibility,
So I wrote this, and I'm
authority.
going to read this out as I wrote this because this is such an important point, and it's also a fabulously depressing way maybe for us to finish up, which is, are future managers genuinely leaders or simply the legally responsible interface between autonomous systems and organizations? And if that's true, this reframes leadership from decision making and moral ownership, escalation judgment, and simply you end up being the person who says no to the machine.
Yeah.
Is that the, maybe that's sort of a good dramatic way to end this first episode, but we have constructed this view of what a manager and a leader is, and I completely take your point about the difference between leader and manager. Do we need to fundamentally reframe what that even means? And it's a bit of a stark statement, but is the role of a manager ultimately the person who says no to a computer?
Yeah.
I say that in a dramatic way because if that's true, that is incredibly depressing.
So I think, there's lots of nuance to this, but there is the role of the user. So in whatever capacity, and that could be the consumer, that the customer, that could be the employee, it could be the driver of the autonomous vehicle. There is the designer of the algorithm, and that might be a group of people. It might be many people over the iterated life of that algorithm, but you are tweaking the rules from which the algorithm comes up with its outcomes or outputs. Then there is the data custodians, and again, very, very difficult in a lot of cases to work out who they are or what they are, that are feeding the raw data into the feedback mechanisms that allow an algorithm to make an inference or make an output. Then there is the owners, the license holders, or the patent holders of the system. And then there is the governance system around that. So if we look at, maybe we'll end on this, we've just seen the controversy around Grok, the LLM system tied to X, both owned by Elon Musk, and we've done a whole couple of episodes now on what we think about Elon Musk and his journey, and there's an influencers episode that I implore you to go and listen to.
Spoiler alert, we think he's an arse. We think he's more of an arse than we wrote it.
We do, yeah, and I think that's only been reinforced by his behaviours since we did that episode. But moving back to the idea, so Grok is an LLM system, for reasons that are probably quite apparent. Actually, there are very few guardrails compared to other LLMs. And that is because Elon Musk has a particular philosophy on moving fast, breaking things. There was an economic or a financial incentive for him to move fast, to catch up and not be pushed out of the market. And for those reasons, there are very few guardrails, and there are very few after market safety mechanisms, safety nets, if you like, to protect users and victims from the negative or bad use of this system. And Grok, quite famously now, has the ability to undress people when you put in a photograph and put them in position, so you can create these pseudo pornographic images, which has huge implications on privacy. There's a whole philosophical and ethical debate there. There's also a very, very clear legal one, because the moment you start doing it about underage people, so when you start creating pseudo pornographic images of children, then there are already clear legal laws in place to protect children, and rightly so. And if you start to use these images for any kind of exploitation, then there is also the legal things in place. So there's all these different stakeholders. Who owns the responsibility? And there's this current discussion around, should the government be putting legal frameworks in place to prevent this from happening? And that's what they're currently doing. And I'm fully supportive of that. But for quite legitimate reasons, legal frameworks are slow, and they need to be slow because
You need to get them right.
you need to get them right. And there's this whole stakeholder balance that I don't think is new. I think we've had this before when we've talked about international trade or we've talked about employment law. I think it's no different with LLMs, apart from the fact that the speed at which these things can operate, the spread, and the difficulty in identifying where that responsibility lies is so much harder because of the vast, vast amount of network space and the ambiguity or opacity in understanding how these systems actually work.
So that was the first question, which is, how can you lead AI or people who use AI? And there's hours more discussion there, which we're going to leave it there today. But honestly, we left it with are you just the person who says to the computer no, which seems pretty depressing if that's what management leadership is. But it beautifully leads on to the next episode, where we're going to talk about the next two questions. We've talked about the fact that the first people to go are likely to be the people who are, in inverted commas, either lower skilled or the AIs can replicate their experience. So how do you create experience and knowledge in humans when the first to go are the junior ones? We'll talk about and explore that. And then we've already touched on this, and there's a risk that it becomes philosophical, but I think there's lots of practical stuff for us to talk about, which is, with few or even no people, what does AI mean for organizations that care about values, cultures, and trust? We have talked, and I think the reality is we can see a world where more and more these roles, in inverted commas, will be replaced by AI. Great. I have no people in my call center. I just have AI. And someone phones up and says, hello, I'm a white Christian who lives in Oxfordshire, and the AI says, you can rod off. We don't like your kind here. Okay, where did that culture come from, and how does a company decide what its culture is? Don't get me wrong, there's technical things we can talk about, but those are the next two questions. This is going to be really sticky, and I think
I'd like to propose a fourth episode as well, which is around the change of surveillance, security, and privacy in a world where LLMs and systems integration, networks of networks and systems exists. And again, it's not something that we have a choice about, but I think we need to understand and explore it.
Well, I will go away after this episode and I will ask the AI whether we're willing to have that question asked. I think I can influence it today. I'm not sure about tomorrow. Let's call it for today. I hope that was interesting and I hope you are keen to come back in our next episode as we explore those future questions. But for now, thank you so much for listening to us. Please, if you haven't already subscribed to the podcast and you found this worth listening to, then please do subscribe. We appear in your inbox every Thursday with a new episode. And obviously over the next couple of weeks, we'll have more episodes about leadership and management in this new world of AI. If you found this interesting and novel, I'm going to use that word novel as in you've not heard anyone talk about this before, please take this as an opportunity for yourselves listening to this to share the conversation, if nothing else. Obviously, we'd love you to share the podcast, but share the conversation with others because, as Gareth has said multiple times in this episode, this is happening. It's not a discussion about whether it will happen. The only conversation is how quick it will happen. And personally, I have to believe the moment businesses say they can shed 20% of their cost base, i.e. human beings, they will not, many of them will hesitate on this and there will be a rush. In fact, we've already seen it. So I think this is coming to us as managers and leaders quicker than you might imagine. We would absolutely, particularly in this case, love to hear what you think about what we've been talking about. What questions have we missed? Did we get it right? Did we get it wrong? What do you think about the future? Even more, what are your experiences of working with AI and how that impacts leadership and management? Please email us on battlingwithbiz@gmail.com. That's the best way for us to see your emails. And we are available on Twitter and Blue Sky on Battling with Biz, in this case with a Z. I think that just about finishes up for this first episode of this series. Have you enjoyed it, Gareth?
I have. It's left me with lots of things to go and ponder.
Yeah. I never know whether to be excited or depressed. I think let's go with excited because there's more human problems to solve.
I think like a lot of things, AI is not a dystopian end of days collapse of humanity, but nor is it the utopian uplands of we're all just going to relax while the robots do all the work. It is a fundamental thing that is changing the world that we live in. We don't have a choice, as we've sort of talked about. It's going to happen, it is happening, and it is part of the evolving tech landscape. It is exciting, it is scary, it is depressing, it is making life easier for a lot of people in a lot of ways. So I think it's not unusual, and it's perfectly sort of fine to be a little bit apprehensive and a little bit excited and a little bit scared.
You've put an image in my head, and this is for people who are older. There used to be an advert for Smash mashed potato that came in packets. And it was very famous for people for a certain age because there were robots talking about Smash. So right now, for this reference to work, please go onto YouTube and search for Smash robots and advert, and it will come up. All I can imagine that in 12 parsecs, these robots will go, humans thought we wouldn't take over and kill them all. So on that bombshell, to use Jeremy Clarkson's terrible phrase, we'll see you next week on Battling with Business.
See you later. Cheerio.